We tend to think of myths as tales about ancient Greeks and gods on Mount Olympus, unicorns and dragons, but the most persistent myths are quite different. They hide in what you consider to be facts, in things you read in a textbook once and have never questioned since, in the stories told by your teacher, who learned it from their teacher, who learned it from another, and none of them bothered to check the original sources. This is exactly what we are going to explore here. 30 stories, 30 revelations, 30 moments when reality proves to be far richer, stranger, and more thrilling than any fictional narrative. If you're ready to discover the truth behind the myths believed for centuries, please support this series with a like and share in the comments which revelation shocked you the most. Your feedback will inspire us to dig into new archives. Let's begin. Myth number 1. The hero created by an artist. December 1776. A biting wind drives sharp needles of snow over the Delaware River. On the other side, Hessian mercenaries, elite professional soldiers in the service of the British Crown, are celebrating Christmas. They do not expect an attack. No one attacks on such a night, in such cold, across such a river. And yet, an attack happens. This very moment was immortalized by artist Emanuel Leutze in 1851, almost 75 years after the event itself. His massive painting, nearly 12 feet high and 20 feet wide, quickly became iconic. George Washington stands in a boat, proudly upright, one leg forward, gaze fixed on the opposite shore. Behind him are a handful of soldiers, rowing through the ice. The painting embodies the determination, courage, and grandeur of a nation's founder. It also represents almost everything that didn't actually happen. Let's start with the most obvious point. Washington didn't stand in the boat. No sensible commander would do that. Crossing the Delaware that night was not a grand parade. It was a nightmare. The river was packed with treacherous ice. The boats were rocking and at risk of capsizing. A soaked and frozen person standing tall amidst such a crossing would not be a hero, but a fool. According to all historical accounts, Washington was sitting, just like everyone else. But Leutze painted this scene not in America, nor in 1776. He created it in Dusseldorf during the revolutions of 1848, when all of Europe was ablaze. For him, the image of Washington was not just a historical document, it was a manifesto. A symbol of liberation meant to inspire European revolutionaries. The artist needed a hero who stood tall, a hero who could be seen from afar, a hero to believe in, and he created one. However, even the scene in the painting is historically inaccurate in details that may seem minor but are telling. The American flag waving over the boat, the famous stars and stripes, did not exist in December 1776. Congress would only approve it in June 1777. The soldiers in the painting are dressed in a uniform that's too neat and proper for the ragged, depleted Continental Army, which was literally dying of hunger and frostbite that winter. According to eyewitness accounts, many were barefoot, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. But now, what really happened? The actual crossing of the Delaware was far more terrifying and majestic than the grand portrait by Lutz. Washington ferried 2,400 soldiers across the icy river in total darkness amidst a snowstorm and freezing winds. The operation took 9 hours instead of the planned 3. 18 heavy cannons were transported on flatboats. The soldiers were so exhausted that some fell asleep while marching toward Trenton. A few perished that night from frostbite, not from enemy bullets, but simply from the cold. And despite all this, they attacked. And they won. They captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, losing only 2 men. The true Washington of that night isn't the ceremonial figure in his full height. He was a man sitting in an icy boat, watching the river while bearing the fate of the revolution on his shoulders. This is a story not about posture, but about will. But the posture turned out to be more convincing than the truth, and the painting spread around the world while the actual details of that night gathered dust in archives. This myth was born from the desire to have a hero as he ought to be, rather than as he was. The next myth is of a different nature. It emerged from the pride of an entire civilization that indeed accomplished something grand, yet later realized it didn't fully understand what it had done. Myth number 2. The secret that didn't exist. The Pantheon in Rome has stood for almost 2,000 years. Its dome, measuring 43 meters in diameter, remained the largest in the world until the 19th century. Today, when you touch its walls, you feel something strange. Concrete that is nearly 2,000 years old is stronger than that which is poured in a neighboring new building. It doesn't crack, it doesn't crumble, it stands. For decades, this has been seen as one of the greatest mysteries in construction history. Scholars, engineers, and historians told the same beautiful story. The Romans possessed a secret recipe for their opus cementitium, concrete, the secret of which was lost with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. The Dark Ages swallowed this knowledge, and humanity spent over 1,000 years relearning what it already knew. This was an exciting story, a civilizational tragedy, an almost poetic metaphor, knowledge disappearing along with the empire, like the light of a lighthouse extinguished by barbarian winds. Almost everything in this story is incorrect. Let's start with the lost secret. In reality, the Romans did not hide their recipes. Mark Vitruvius Pollio, an architect and engineer from the 1st century BC, authored a 10-volume work titled On Architecture. He dedicated a significant portion of it to a detailed description of building materials, including the compositions of concrete mixes. This book has never been lost. It was copied in monasteries throughout the Middle Ages and widely read. Medieval builders were well aware of Roman concrete. The issue was different, however. They were unable to replicate it. This wasn't due to a lack of knowledge about the recipe, but rather because a key ingredient was inaccessible outside certain geographical areas. This ingredient was volcanic ash known as pozzolana, which had unique chemical properties and was sourced from the vicinity of Puteoli, modern Pozzuoli, in Campania. It was this ash that was mixed with lime and seawater, creating the legendary effect. Modern research conducted by a team from the University of California, Berkeley in 2017 finally explained why Roman marine concrete only became stronger over time. It turns out that seawater, seeping through the structure for centuries, reacted with a mineral called aluminum tobermorite, which forms when pozzolana interacts with lime. This reaction didn't destroy the concrete, as occurs with modern Portland cement. Instead, it crystallized within it, making it stronger. In other words, Roman concrete didn't just not break down, it literally self-healed over the course of 2,000 years. The secret wasn't lost, it was geographically unavailable. But this geographic unavailability is a much less romantic story than the great lost secret of a fallen civilization. As a result, the myth persisted until scientists took samples from the docks of Caesarea Maritima and placed them under an electron microscope. What's important to understand is that the Romans themselves likely didn't fully grasp why their concrete worked in this way. They knew to use pozzolana. They understood that seawater was preferable to freshwater, but the mechanism of the reaction at a molecular level was beyond their comprehension. It was practical wisdom accumulated over centuries of construction experience, not theoretical knowledge that could be written down and passed on. And therein lies the true irony of the story. We spent centuries lamenting a lost secret that had never really gone anywhere at all. It was only deciphered when we learned to look at stone through an electron microscope. This myth underscores our tendency to see the past as a golden age lost due to someone's fault. The next myth speaks to another human weakness, our readiness to turn a living, complex person into a flawless icon, even in defiance of all evidence. Myth number 3. The woman who knew it all. February 1903. A laboratory in Paris on Loman Street is filled with the scent of chemical reagents. At the workbench is a woman destined to win the Nobel Prize twice. Maria Skłodowska-Curie worked with radioactive substances using her bare hands. No gloves, no protective screen. She sometimes carried test tubes filled with radium in the pocket of her coat, noting in her journal how beautifully they glowed in the dark. For decades after her death in 1934, the world told a touching story, a great scientist unaware of the dangers. A pioneer who fell victim to her own discovery. A martyr of science who died in innocent ignorance. This narrative seemed particularly tragic and true, for how else could one explain that the smartest woman of her time handled materials that ultimately led to her demise so recklessly? There is an explanation, and it is far more complicated than naive ignorance. Maria Curie was aware of the dangers of radioactive radiation. In fact, she was one of the first to begin to grasp it. In the early years of the 20th century, she and her husband Pierre documented in their records that working with radioactive materials caused skin burns and irritation of mucous membranes. Pierre intentionally applied radium preparations to his arm, documenting the resulting damage. Maria herself noted in her letters the increasing fatigue, pain in her arms, and deteriorating vision. In 1906, after Pierre was killed by a horse-drawn carriage, she continued her work. By 1921, when she arrived in the United States to receive a gram of radium gifted by American women who had raised $100,000, she was so ill that she could barely stand during the ceremonial reception. By then, she had nearly gone blind from cataracts. Her fingers were covered with non-healing burns, and she suffered from constant ringing in her ears. Yet she kept working. Why? This is where the true story begins. Maria Curie lived in an era when the science of radiation was still in its infancy. The mechanisms of ionizing radiation, its ability to damage DNA, cause aplastic anemia, provoke leukemia, were not yet understood. Burns and fatigue were regarded as unpleasant but possibly tolerable professional risks. At that time, it was impossible to establish a link between chronic exposure and fatal blood diseases. There was a lack of research tools and accumulated statistics. In other words, she knew it was dangerous, but she didn't know how dangerous. And, importantly, she consciously accepted that risk. In her personal notes, there is a phrase that is rarely quoted. She wrote that science demands researchers be willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of knowledge. This was not bravado, it was a conscious position. The woman who received 2 Nobel Prizes, the first for the discovery of polonium and radium, the second for studying their chemical properties, understood perfectly well that she was paying with her own body. She chose this path. The myth of innocent ignorance is convenient because it paints her as a victim. The real story portrays her as something more complex, and perhaps more majestic. A person who saw the abyss and still stepped to the edge because, on the other side, there was knowledge. Her notebooks are still stored in lead containers at the National Library of France. If you wish to study them, you will be asked to sign a waiver. Even after 80 years, they remain too radioactive to handle with bare hands. She knew this, yet she continued to work. This myth of the ignorant victim gives way to another, one of a different kind of ignorance. We often think medieval cartographers were savages drawing a flat earth, but the reality is far more complex and fascinating. Myth number 4. The flat earth no one drew. Open any popular book about the Middle Ages, and you are likely to find a page featuring a map shaped like a disc, a flat world surrounded by ocean, with Jerusalem at the center and monsters at the edges. The caption reads, "This is how medieval people envisioned the earth." This illustration is one of the most persistent historical falsehoods in Western culture. Let's clarify a basic fact that everyone educated should know. Medieval scholars, monks, astronomers, and navigators were well aware that the earth is a sphere. This was not a secret revealed during the Renaissance. This knowledge did not vanish from antiquity. Aristotle proved the Earth's spherical shape in the 4th century BC by observing the shadow of the Earth on the moon during lunar eclipses. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century BC, using shadows from columns in 2 different cities. Ptolemy developed a detailed system of spherical mapping in the 2nd century AD. And all of this was studied, copied, and read during the Middle Ages. So where did the disk maps come from? This leads us to a truly intriguing story. The type of map in question is known as Mappe Mundi, or Maps of the World. The most famous of these is the Hereford map, created around the year 1300. It does indeed have a circular shape, and Jerusalem is indeed at the center. But to call it a flat Earth map is like claiming that the London Underground map proves the British believed in rectangular tunnels. Mappe Mundi were not navigational charts. They were theological and philosophical diagrams. They represented not geography, but the meaningful structure of the cosmos, sacred history laid out in space. Jerusalem is at the center, because it is the spiritual core of the Christian world, not because a monk thought it was the geographic pole of the earth. Paradise is in the east, because, in Christian symbolism, the east signifies beginnings and rebirth. The monsters at the edges signify the boundaries of the known world, the realm of the unknown. Those who created these maps concurrently used portolan charts, detailed navigational maps that remain impressively accurate today. Genoese and Catalan navigators in the 13th and 14th centuries had portolans of the Mediterranean with such precision that computer analysis in the 20th century revealed an error margin of only a few percent. These maps did not assume a flat Earth. They required an understanding of the curvature of the Earth's surface for accurate distance calculations. But where did the myth originate? It was literally invented in the 19th century. American writer Washington Irving, in his fictional biography of Christopher Columbus published in 1828, created a scene where Columbus argues with ignorant medieval monks who believed in a flat Earth. Nothing like that ever happened. In reality, the scholars of that time opposed Columbus for a different reason. They thought he underestimated the distance to Asia. They were right. Columbus miscalculated by nearly 20,000 kilometers. He was only saved by the fact that a continent, which no one suspected existed, was in his way. The myth of the medieval flat Earth is not a historical fact. It is a propaganda tool invented during the era of positivism to show how science triumphs over religious ignorance. It didn't triumph because it never actually fought this battle. This was a lie in favor of progress. The next story is about a myth that took root through a completely different mechanism: simple geographical ignorance that became surrounded by legends. Myth number 5. Tea that came from the East directly. In Russia, tea is consumed in a unique way, through a piece of sugar in a glass with a metal holder alongside a saucer, distinctly separate from the rest of Europe both in method and taste. Russian tea traditions are so unique that it seems they must have a special story. And that story exists, only it's not the one usually told. Most people, if asked where tea came from in Russia, would probably respond through Europe, along with other Western fashions, like coffee, like tobacco, like waistcoats with fasteners. The era of Peter the Great, Europeanization, tea from Holland or Britain. This is fundamentally incorrect. Tea entered Russia from the East, not just from the East in a broad sense, but through a remarkably specific route that constitutes one of the greatest trade epics in human history. And this happened nearly 100 years before tea became popular in Western Europe. In 1638, Russian ambassador Vasily Starkov returned from Mongolia, bringing an unusual gift for Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich from Mongolian Khan Altan: several kilograms of dried leaves. The Khan offered them as a valuable medicinal remedy. The royal court tried the drink and initially received it without much enthusiasm. Legend has it that Starkov even attempted to refuse the gift, considering it too modest for a diplomatic exchange, but the Khan insisted. This seemingly random episode set off one of the most significant trade arteries in history. In 1689, Russia and China signed the Nerchinsk Treaty, the first official agreement between the two powers. One of its most important consequences was the establishment of regular trade along what became known as the Tea Road, a route through Kyakhta, a border trading town where Russian furs were exchanged for Chinese tea. This route began operating before the East India Company's maritime trade routes established tea supplies to Western Europe. The Kyakhta tea route spans 18,000 kilometers through Mongolia, Siberia, and the European part of Russia. Camel and horse caravans traveled for months. This long overland journey shaped the unique tastes of Russian tea drinking. The tea transported such a long way acquired different flavor qualities compared to that delivered by fast ships. Russians grew accustomed to a stronger, richer, and slightly smoky taste, and this became regarded as the proper tea. By the 18th century, tea consumption in Russia was so high that the samovar, a symbol of Russian tea drinking, became a national household item, manufactured in whole factories in Tula. By this time, the British East India Company was just beginning to expand its tea operations. When the Trans-Siberian Railway was constructed at the end of the 19th century, it partly followed the routes established by tea caravans 200 years prior. Tea arrived in Russia from the east, directly through the steppes and mountains, long before it became a European fashion. The myth of European origins of Russian tea drinking is simply a misunderstanding of how vast and interconnected Eurasia was even in the 17th century. This myth is one of geographical ignorance. The next one is about ignorance of another kind, our tendency to attribute certain traits to historical figures that are most convenient for us to acknowledge. Myth number 6. The Gandhi we don't know. The name Gandhi has become synonymous with absolute nonviolence. In modern culture, it has turned into a sort of logo for pacifism, so universal that it is mentioned alongside the names of Buddha and Martin Luther King in any conversation about peaceful resistance. His quotes on nonviolence are embroidered on pillows and printed on mugs. His image appears monolithic and unequivocal. The real Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was far more complex, controversial, and at times downright shocking. Let's start with a fact that is particularly inconvenient for this image. Gandhi actively supported involvement in military conflicts twice in his life and called on others to do the same. The first time was in 1999 during the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. Gandhi, then living in Natal, organized the Indian Ambulance Corps to serve the British troops. He personally recruited volunteers, convincing them that fighting alongside Britain was a moral duty, a way to prove loyalty to the empire, and improve the status of the Indian community in South Africa. The Corps had over 1,100 volunteers. They did not carry weapons, but they supported the military machine that killed people. The second time was in 1906, during the suppression of the Zulu leader Bambatha's uprising. Gandhi again organized an Indian Ambulance Corps for British troops suppressing this uprising. In his letters, he described how his people carried wounded British soldiers off the battlefield, while Zulus were dying nearby. He would later write that it was at that moment, seeing the suffering of the Zulus, that something new began to take shape within him. But back in 1906, he was on the British side. In 1914, upon returning to India, Gandhi once again supported the British call, this time to participate in World War I. He actively recruited Indian volunteers for the British Army, traveling across Gujarat and giving speeches about duty. This drew sharp criticism even from his own allies. How could a man who preached non-violence encourage others to kill? Gandhi had a response, a complex philosophical answer that he developed throughout his life. The essence of it was this: the principle of non-violence, or ahimsa, is an ideal to strive for. However, a living person in an imperfect world sometimes faces a choice between two forms of violence. Supporting one side against the other can, under certain circumstances, be the lesser evil. Nonviolence is not an absolute prohibition against any participation in conflict. It is a mindset that requires constant, painful choices. This is a deep and honest position, yet it is radically different from the image of the impeccable saint in a white dhoti that decorates cushions embroidered with quotes. There was also another aspect of his views that is often left unspoken. His early writings about the inhabitants of South Africa contain statements that, by modern standards, are clearly racist. He wrote about black people and Zulus in terms incompatible with the image of a humanitarian. Later, he revised many of these views, but they existed. This evolution, this journey from prejudice to humanity, makes his story far more relatable and significant than the impeccable legend of a born pacifist. The real Gandhi is a story of a man who changed, who made mistakes, rethought his ideas, sometimes contradicted himself, and from this painful self-examination, created something that truly changed the world. This myth was born from our need for untainted heroes. The next myth arises from a completely different need: the desire of elite institutions to control their image. Myth number 7. The Foreign Legion that wasn't there. The French Foreign Legion, just the name resonates with a unique allure. Adventurers without a past. Runaways from the law and broken hearts. People who approach a recruiter without a name and receive a new one. Germans, Russians, Spaniards, Americans, all nations under one banner with the battle cry, "Legion is our homeland." This is true, but there is one detail in this truth that is often overlooked because it disrupts the beautiful narrative. The French Foreign Legion has always had a significant number of French soldiers serving in its ranks. The Legion was established in 1831 by King Louis Philippe specifically to employ foreign soldiers in French colonial wars. The idea was politically elegant. If Germans and Swiss were dying in Algeria or Madagascar, it raised far fewer questions in the National Assembly than if French citizens were involved. Foreign casualties fit the French imperialistic agenda. That's why the Legion officially did not accept French citizens. However, in reality, Frenchmen always made up a significant portion of the Legionnaires, a fact confirmed by historical records of the Legion itself. The mechanism was simple. A Frenchman would approach the recruiter, give a fictional name, and claim to be Belgian, Swiss, or Luxembourgian. The recruiter, recognizing the accent, would note down Belgian. No one checked. This was so well known that within the Legion there was an unofficial term for such individuals. Légionnaire Belge became a euphemism for a Frenchman hiding behind a foreign name. Officers were aware of this. Command knew. It was an open secret that was maintained because the Legion needed soldiers, and young Frenchmen sometimes needed to disappear, to flee from debts, family scandals, or legal troubles. The rule banning French citizens was eventually officially revised. Since 1932, Frenchmen have been allowed to officially join the Legion. Today, French citizens make up about 24% of the total number of legionnaires, the largest single national group. The Foreign Legion has always been full of Frenchmen. They simply pretended to be someone else, just like many actual foreigners who join the Legion under fictional names. This doesn't ruin the romance of the Legion. Rather, it makes it more honest. It was an institution created for people who wanted to become someone else. It didn't matter who you were before. The Legion accepted everyone, including those posing as foreigners while being French. If this myth about the famous institution surprises you, the next one, about a famous event, will be even more shocking. Because the first flight by the Wright brothers, which was supposed to change the world, initially went unnoticed by the world. Myth number 8, a triumph no one saw. December 17, 1903, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. A deserted beach, a cold wind from the Atlantic. Orville Wright lies down in a homemade aircraft while brother Wilbur holds the wing, helping with the takeoff. The engine sputters to life. The flyer lifts off the ground. 12 seconds, 37 meters. The first controlled, powered flight in human history. That day, the brothers made 4 flights. The longest lasted 59 seconds and covered 260 meters. 5 witnesses observed this event, 4 locals and a lifeguard. Upon returning home to Dayton, the brothers sent a telegram to their father. Success! 4 flights on Thursday morning, all against a 21-mile wind. How did the world react to this discovery? With an explosion of excitement? Sensational headlines in newspapers? Immediate recognition as the greatest technological breakthrough of the century? No. The newspapers that the Wright brothers sent their press release to largely ignored the news, or printed it with factual errors on the inside pages. The Dayton newspaper, local to the Wright brothers, ran a headline saying, "Dayton boys fly." No details, no understanding of the significance of the event. Why? Partly because, in the same year, 1903, there were several other contenders for the first flight, and the public was tired of sensational claims, most of which turned out to be false or exaggerated. Partly because the Wright brothers were not masters of publicity themselves. They were bicycle mechanics from rural Ohio, without academic degrees or patrons from the scientific establishment. But the main reason was different. The first flights were actually quite modest compared to what was promised. 37 meters is about a third of a football field. The audience needed to see something far more impressive to believe. For the next 2 years, the brothers worked on their design completely alone, without an audience, without journalists, and without government funding. By 1905, the Flyer 3 could stay in the air for over half an hour and perform complex maneuvers. The brothers wrote to the U.S. War Department offering to sell their invention. They received a rejection. The commission deemed the project premature. When Wilbur Wright arrived in France in 1908 and conducted public flights over the Le Mans airfield, Europe exploded. French newspapers wrote about a revolution. Crowds came to watch again and again. French aviators who saw themselves as leaders were shocked. The brothers were years ahead. It took 5 years for the world to notice the invention that changed everything. The first flight was met not with excitement, but with silence, because the world was not ready to understand what had happened on that beach in December 1903. This is a myth about our deafness to great events. The next myth is about our tendency to simplify political catastrophes into understandable narratives. Myth number 9. The beer hall putsch that failed forever. November 9, 1923, Munich. Adolf Hitler steps out of the Bürger Braukeller beer hall leading a column of stormtroopers heading toward the city center. Ahead is a police blockade. Shots are fired. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers are killed. Hitler falls to the ground, either wounded or hiding. The coup fails. He is arrested. This is where the beer hall putsch is usually said to end. A failed attempt to seize power by force, after which Hitler realized he needed to come to power through elections. That's true. But it's only half the truth, and the other half changes everything. In court, Hitler turned his defeat into a triumph. The event was broadcasted throughout Germany. Hitler spoke for hours, blaming the Weimar Republic, the Jews, and the November criminals. Judges sympathetic to the nationalists allowed him to speak. Newspapers ran his speeches. In just 1 week of the trial, Hitler gained nationwide recognition that he had never experienced before. Before the coup, he was a provincial Bavarian politician. After the trial, he became a national figure. The verdict was unimaginably lenient. 5 years in prison with a possibility of early release, in Landsberg Fortress with comfortable conditions. He was released after 9 months. During those 9 months, he dictated Mein Kampf. Moreover, the coup changed his strategy. Hitler realized that a military takeover was impossible. The army and police would not support him. He needed elections. He directed all his energy towards creating an electoral machine, a cult of oratory, and a propaganda apparatus. In that sense, the beer hall putsch was not a failure. It transformed. The defeat of 8,623 Nazis on the streets of Munich became the beginning of a political career that 10 years later would lead their leader to power through seemingly legitimate methods. The Nazi Party did not come to power through a coup, but without the coup, and without the trial that turned Hitler into a national martyr, everything could have turned out differently. This myth of failure conceals a much darker story about how defeat can be a prelude to victory if used correctly. The next story is about another kind of victory, a man we remember as a revolutionary, but who merely completed the work started by others. Myth number 10. An evolution not conceived by Darwin. November 24, 1859, London. A book titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection hits the shelves. The author is Charles Darwin. The first print run of 1,250 copies sells out on the very first day. Since then, the name Darwin has become inseparable from the theory of evolution, to the extent that most people see them as synonyms. Darwin's theory, Darwinian evolution. It seems as if no one had thought about it before him. This is, to put it mildly, an exaggeration. To put it bluntly, it is an injustice to the people whose ideas Darwin developed, clarified, and systematized. Let's start with the most obvious. Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, published a poem titled Zoonomia in 1796, where he explored ideas about the transmutation of species, meaning their change over time. He explicitly wrote that all warm-blooded creatures could have originated from one common ancestor. This happened 63 years before On the Origin of Species. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck published Philosophie zoologique in 1809, the first systematic theory of biological evolution. His mechanism, inheritance of acquired traits, was later disproved, but the idea of species changing over time was clearly and fully articulated. But the most important and least known character in this story is Alfred Russel Wallace. In February 1858, Charles Darwin received a letter from Malaysia. It was written by a young naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was working in the field on the Moluccas Islands. In this letter, Wallace outlined his theory of natural selection, virtually identical to what Darwin had been secretly working on for the past 20 years. For Darwin, it was a shock. He knew that if he didn't publish his work immediately, Wallace would get ahead of him and claim all the credit. Wallace's letter compelled Darwin, who was naturally a perfectionist and had delayed publication for years, to finally release his book. A gentleman's agreement was reached through intermediaries. In July 1858, at a meeting of the Linnean Society in London, both Darwin's manuscript and Wallace's essay were read simultaneously to establish joint priority. Wallace, who was on the other side of the world at the time, learned about this only after it happened. He claimed not to mind. He was thrilled by the scope of Darwin's work. However, history remembers Darwin, partly because his book was incomparably more detailed and evidential, partly because he had connections in the British scientific establishment, while Wallace did not, and partly simply because history tends to favor one name over two. Evolution is not the idea of a single person. It is a concept that ripened in several minds simultaneously. Darwin contributed the most to its proof, but to call it solely his theory is to overlook the people without whom it might have emerged differently or later. This myth of the lonely genius is one of the most enduring in the history of science. The next myth is about another prevailing misconception, this time concerning individuals we tend to pity. Myth number 11. Peasants who rested more than us. When we think of a medieval peasant, a specific image comes to mind: a hunched back over a plow, working from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Life as a continuous toil under the watchful eye of a stern lord. This image is largely a fabrication. Moreover, it is a fabrication that conveniently serves multiple ideologies, for those who wanted to showcase the progress of capitalism and for those who wanted to highlight its horrors. The former said, "Look how far we've come from medieval poverty." The latter said, "See how capitalism turned free people into serfs?" Both used the same caricature of the medieval peasant. In reality, a medieval peasant had, by some estimates, more days off than the modern office worker. Research by medievalists, particularly the work of Juliet Shore published in the 1990s, revealed the following. The medieval Catholic calendar included, depending on the region and era, 52 Sundays plus 40 to 60 feast days each year. This meant that a third, and sometimes even more than a third, of the year was officially dedicated to religious holidays, during which work was outright prohibited, not just discouraged, but specifically forbidden by church decrees. Additionally, the agricultural year had a clear seasonality. Winter in medieval Europe was a time of minimal activity. The main farming tasks, plowing, seeding, and harvesting, were concentrated in relatively short periods. In the gaps between these peak periods, there was significantly less work to be done. It's important to understand that the concept of a workday in the Middle Ages was fundamentally different. There was no idea of an 8-hour workday, neither as a standard nor as an ideal. People worked while there was light and while there was work to do. Then they stopped. Sometimes they took breaks for meals, conversations, or prayers. The modern concept of continuous working hours is a product of the Industrial Revolution, not the feudal system. This, of course, does not mean that the life of a medieval peasant was easy. It was hard, dangerous, and unpredictable. A poor harvest meant famine. Illness often led to death. Armies passing through a village brought devastation. The average life expectancy was low, and child mortality rates were high. But there's a vast difference between a life full of dangers and constant toil without a single day off. A medieval peasant was not a workaholic in our sense of the word. They had a different structure of time, more intermittent, closely tied to natural cycles, holidays, and communal life. The image of a peasant working relentlessly ironically mirrors the industrial worker of the 19th century projected back into history. It was during that time that 12-hour work shifts without any days off became commonplace. It was then that the holidays that the church had protected for centuries vanished. Industrial capitalism did to working hours what feudalism never did. The next myth is also about seeing things that aren't what they seem, but this time, it revolves around stone. Myth number 12, the nose that wasn't there. The Great Sphinx of Giza gazes eastward with empty eye sockets and a faceless stone visage. This is a familiar image, so familiar that few ever ask, when exactly did the nose disappear? Most people, if asked, would respond something like this: Napoleon. His troops used the Sphinx as a target for artillery practice. Some might mention the Crusaders. Others might just shrug. However, there is well-documented evidence pointing to a specific person and a specific time. The Arab historian al-Makrizi recorded an account in the 15th century about a Muslim zealot named Muhammad Sa'im al-Da'ar. In the year 1378, this man approached the Sphinx and deliberately broke off its nose upon seeing local peasants offering sacrifices to it as if it were an idol. He was arrested and executed for this, not for destroying a historical monument, but for causing economic damage as his actions incited unrest. This account is from the year 1378, which is nearly 420 years before Napoleon's arrival in Egypt. The Napoleon version surfaced later and is based on absolutely no evidence. Interestingly, this idea spread because Napoleon had a complex reputation in Egypt, and historical imagination eagerly attributed various misdeeds to him in that land. There is not a single document, not a single witness account, nor a military report that mentions the Sphinx being shot at. However, there are drawings by European artists who visited Egypt long before Napoleon's expedition, and in all of these drawings, the Sphinx is already missing its nose. It's noteworthy that earlier medieval Arab sources described the Sphinx with a nose. This means the nose existed for many centuries after the Arabs conquered Egypt in the 7th century. Images of the Sphinx with a nose appear in sources up until the 14th century, which aligns with the date provided by al-Makrizi. Another aspect that is often overlooked is that the Sphinx was originally painted. Not just a gray-yellow limestone, there were bright colors. Traces of red paint remain on the neck. The face was likely red. This was the traditional color for male faces in Egyptian art. This makes our common image of the ancient gray Sphinx as inaccurate as if we were looking at a faded copy of the Sistine Chapel and thinking that was how it looked during Michelangelo's time. Napoleon did not destroy the Sphinx's nose. The nose vanished 4 centuries before he arrived. This does not absolve Napoleon of his many other misdeeds. His Egyptian expedition caused significant destruction, but the Sphinx is not his doing. This myth persists because we need a specific culprit. The nameless religious iconoclasm of the 14th century is not as compelling as a famous villain wearing a tricorn hat. The next myth also speaks to our tendency to oversimplify. This time, it concerns the people we consider representatives of one nation. Myth number 13. The apostles we do not know. 12 apostles. In the public consciousness, 12 Jews from Judea, the closest followers of Jesus of Nazareth, a Galilean. A homogeneous group from the same cultural background. This is a simplification that obscures a far more intriguing picture. Let's start with the most obvious case, Simon the Zealot. His nickname, Zealot, directly indicates his association with the Zealot movement, Jewish revolutionaries who called for armed resistance against Roman occupation. This was not merely a religious group. It was a political faction for whom violence against the occupiers was a legitimate tool. Now, consider Matthew, or Levi. He was a tax collector in service to Rome. In the eyes of Jewish society at that time, this was not just an unpleasant profession. Tax collectors were seen as collaborators, traitors to their people. They worked for the occupiers, profiting at the expense of their fellow countrymen, and were excluded from normal religious and social life within the community. In other words, among the 12 apostles, there were both an anti-Roman revolutionary and a man who collaborated with Rome. It's like putting a partisan and a police officer from an occupying administration into the same group. But let's go further. Andrew and Peter were brothers and fishermen from Bethsaida, a city mainly populated by Greeks. The very name Bethsaida is Greek. Andrew has a Greek name. In the Gospel of John, it is to Andrew and Philip that some Greeks approach, wanting to see Jesus. This suggests that Andrew spoke Greek and acted as a bridge between the Greek-speaking audience and their Aramaic-speaking teacher. Philip also has a distinctly Greek name and is from the same city of Bethsaida. This again points to a cultural environment deeply influenced by Hellenism, rather than just a Jewish setting. There's no reason to believe that any of the apostles were not Jewish by birth. However, they lived in a world where Jewish, Greek, Aramaic, and Roman cultures blended so deeply that the concept of a homogeneous national group was almost meaningless. First-century Galilee was literally a cultural melting pot. Judas, the betrayer of the apostolic group, was apparently from Kerioth in Judea, making him the only true Judean among the Galilean team. This is not a random detail. The gospel text emphasizes the ethnic difference between him and the others. The composition of the apostles reflects the true diversity of first-century Palestinian society, with its political factions, cultural layers, and linguistic boundaries. This was not a homogeneous brotherhood, but something much more complex and indeed more human. The next myth comes from a different cultural tradition, but pertains to the same theme: our attempts to simplify a complex reality into one straightforward cause. Myth number 14. A war that wasn't caused by a woman. The face that launched 1,000 ships. This is how Christopher Marlowe described Helen of Troy. The most beautiful woman in the world, who was either abducted or ran away with the Trojan prince Paris. A 10-year war, thousands of deaths, the fall of a great city, all because of one woman. It's a beautiful story. It has existed for 3,000 years. It is so narratively well-structured that it almost feels a shame to dismantle it. But even within Homer's own texts, this version doesn't hold up under scrutiny. And when we move beyond the Iliad and see what historians and archaeologists have discovered about the late Bronze Age in the Aegean region, the picture becomes entirely different. Let's start with Homer. The Iliad is not a story about the causes of the war. It's a story about the wrath of Achilles. About honor, insult, friendship, and death. Helen appears relatively rarely in the text, and when she does, in the famous scene upon the walls of Troy, she gazes at the fighting men with bitter weariness, calling herself a bitch and the source of all woes. This is not a portrait of a triumphant beauty-inspiring war. It's a portrait of a captive of fate, tired of what's unfolding around her. When it comes to the real reasons behind the conflict, Troy is a historical city identified with the Hisarlik Mound in present-day Turkey. The Trojan War, if it had a historical basis, occurred around the 12th to 13th centuries BCE, during a major crisis of the late Bronze Age, when several advanced civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed nearly simultaneously. Troy controlled the Hellespont Strait, the entrance to the Black Sea. This was a strategically vital point for trade. Amber, grain, and metals from the north passed through this strait. The Greek city-states, reliant on Black Sea trade, had significant economic reasons to control this route. Hittite archives, decoded in the 20th century, contain numerous references to conflicts in western Anatolia, a region the Hittites called Walusa, which linguists link to the Greek Ilium. Hittite texts reference Greek Achaeans warriors in this area. This is not mythology, it is diplomatic correspondence. The real war, if it existed, was fought for control over trade routes, for regional hegemony, for resources. This does not mean that abductions of women did not occur. Such things were common in that era. However, over a woman as the sole reason is a poetic image created to give the conflict a human scale. Telling the story through Helen's perspective is literary genius by Homer. But taking this as a historical explanation is a mistake. The next myth is also about war, but one that happened much closer to our time. Myth number 15. A secret that wasn't secret. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima. The world is shaken. The Soviet Union declares war on Japan. The war ends. Immediately, a myth emerges in the West that Soviet intelligence only learned about the atomic bomb when it dropped on the Japanese city, that the Manhattan Project was completely airtight, that Stalin was caught off guard. Stalin was not caught off guard. He knew about the Manhattan Project in detail from the very beginning. The intelligence operation of Soviet special services to infiltrate the American atomic program began long before the first American reactor reached critical mass. The network of Soviet agents within the Manhattan Project was one of the most successful intelligence operations of the 20th century. Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist working at Los Alamos, provided Soviet intelligence with detailed technical drawings and calculations as early as 1943. David Greenglass passed information through his sister Ethel Rosenberg and her husband Julius. Theodore Hall, a brilliant physicist who joined Los Alamos at the age of 18, became a Soviet agent on his own initiative, convinced that the U.S. monopoly on atomic weapons was dangerous for the world. By the time of the first American bomb test at Trinity, New Mexico, in July 1945, Soviet intelligence had enough information for their physicists to begin work on their own bomb. The Soviet atomic project, led by Kurchatov, began in 1942, just a year after the start of the Manhattan Project. A famous moment during the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Truman casually informed Stalin that the United States has a weapon of unusual destructive power. Truman is keenly observing Stalin's reaction, expecting surprise. Stalin, however, responds coolly, expressing hope that it would be used against Japan, and quickly moves on to other topics. Churchill, watching the scene unfold, concluded that Stalin didn't get the hint. The British Prime Minister was mistaken. Stalin understood perfectly because he already knew everything. Upon returning to the Soviet delegation, he immediately ordered the acceleration of the efforts. The first Soviet atomic bomb was detonated in August 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima. American experts had predicted that the Soviet project would take anywhere from 10 to 20 years. Intelligence data halved that timeline. The myth of the Hermetic Manhattan Project conceals one of the greatest counterintelligence failures in history. The next myth is of a different kind, about geographical ignorance that has become an international curiosity. Myth number 16, the capital that doesn't appear on postcards. If you've ever asked a stranger on the street where the capital of Australia is, there's a high likelihood you would have received Sydney as the answer. Sometimes Melbourne, rarely the correct answer. The capital of Australia is Canberra, a city created from scratch in the early 20th century, nearly literally out of thin air and political compromise. The story of its creation is itself a small masterpiece of human irony. When the scattered Australian colonies united into a federation in 1901, the immediate question arose, where should the capital be located? Sydney and Melbourne, the two largest and most powerful cities in the country, fiercely contested this issue with a fervor that is incompatible with the image of the calm and friendly Australian. Sydney residents considered their city the obvious capital, the oldest, the most famous, the gateway to Australia. Melbourne disagreed. It was the wealthiest, the most European, the true cultural hub. Each side had compelling arguments. Each categorically refused to yield to the other. The constitutional resolution was elegant in its absurdity. The capital must be in New South Wales, the state of Sydney, but no closer than 100 miles from Sydney itself. This meant the capital would be in a neutral zone, far enough away that neither rival could claim victory. In 1908, an international competition was held to design the new capital. It was won by American architect Walter Burley Griffin from Chicago, with a design for a garden city around an artificial lake. Officially, Canberra was named in 1913 when Lady Denman, wife of the Governor-General, opened a bottle of wine over the cornerstone. The name Canberra has an uncertain origin, most likely from the Ngunnawal language meaning something like meeting place or the place of the woman with breasts. However, what's particularly noteworthy is that even when Canberra was established and functioning as the capital, Melbourne remained the de facto capital for another quarter century, since that's where Parliament met. It wasn't until 1927 that Parliament officially moved to Canberra. The construction of the new Parliament House stretched over another 60 years, officially opening only in 1988. The myth of Sydney as the capital persists because Sydney represents tourist Australia, the one with the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge. Canberra, on the other hand, embodies administrative Australia, intentionally modest and neutral. It was created not as a showcase, but as a compromise. And compromise isn't the most thrilling image for a postcard. The next myth is about another compromise, but in the realm of knowledge. Who we credit with the invention of the university. Myth number 17. The university that wasn't the first. The University of Bologna, founded in the year 1088, it is officially considered the oldest university in the world. This is a point of pride for Italian culture, a hallmark of European civilization. But this is also incorrect. Or, more precisely, it depends on how we define university. If we understand a university as an institution of higher education offering degrees in multiple disciplines, then Bologna was indeed a very early example of this in Europe. However, if we refer to a higher educational institution where various sciences are systematically taught and qualifications are awarded, the history is much longer and more complex. Al-Qadawiyyin in Fez, Morocco, founded in the year 859. That's 229 years earlier than Bologna. The Guinness World Records recognizes Al-Qadawiyyin as the oldest existing, continually operating higher educational institution in the world. It was founded by a woman, Fatima al-Fihri, the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Kairouan. She inherited her father's fortune and dedicated it entirely to the construction of an educational institution that still stands today. Al-Azhar in Cairo. Founded in the year 970, it has been functioning continuously for over 1,000 years. It is one of the leading Islamic universities in the world, with a long-standing tradition in teaching theology, law, grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, and astronomy. Nalanda in India. This Buddhist monastic university operated from the 5th to the 13th century and, at the height of its glory, accommodated about 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. Students came from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, and Central Asia. Historical accounts describe the Nalanda Library as occupying several multi-story buildings and containing millions of manuscripts. All of this was destroyed in the year 1235 during the Mongol invasion. The myth of the first university in Europe as the first university in the world exemplifies a classic Eurocentrism in the history of education. This perspective didn't arise from malice, but rather from the tendency to narrate global history through a European lens. Bologna was the first in Europe to establish the very legal structure we associate with universities today: formal degrees, a charter, and a corporate status for students. However, claiming to be the first of its kind in Europe is fundamentally different from being the first in the world. This myth highlights how cultures claim superiority. The next myth illustrates how cultures fabricate legends about great individuals. Myth number 18. The self-made hero. Theodore Roosevelt. One of the most physically active presidents in American history, a big game hunter, cowboy, colonel of the Rough Riders Cavalry Regiment who conquered Cuba during the Spanish-American War, a symbol of masculinity and physical strength. Few people know that as a child, he struggled with severe asthma. Theodore Roosevelt was born in October 1858 in New York City into a wealthy family. From a young age, he suffered from debilitating asthma attacks, so severe that his family doubted he would reach adulthood. In his memoirs, he recalled nights when he couldn't breathe, lying on pillows in a half-sitting position while his father carried him around the room, trying to ease his distress. His parents took him to the mountains for fresh air and tried every medical remedy available at the time. His father played a crucial role in what happened next. One day, when Teddy was about 12, his father took him to a small gym and said something like, "You have a mind, but your body will fail you if you don't build it. You must create your body." And Theodore began to build. It was a years-long, methodical, and grueling journey. He took up boxing, despite barely being able to breathe after each session, wrestling, rowing, horseback riding. Slowly, Very slowly, his lungs grew stronger. His asthma attacks became less frequent. By the time he was 20, he was a man of extraordinary physical strength. But the asthma never went away. President Roosevelt periodically suffered from attacks throughout his life. He simply learned how to work through them. The story of his physical transformation was well known in his time. He often shared it, understanding the propaganda value of a narrative about a man who forged himself from a frail body. Yet, over time, the story became simplified. The image of the hero remained, overshadowing the act of will that created that image. This shifts the significance of his physical achievements. The chest wound during his campaign speech in 1912, where he continued speaking for an hour and a half with a bullet in his chest, is not merely a quirky anecdote about a lucky politician. It continues the same story. A man whose body had tried to kill him since childhood learned to disregard physical pain as something familiar. The true story is stronger than the myth. The next myth involves a different kind of transformation, one that's chronological. Myth number 19. The revolution that happened in November. The Great October Socialist Revolution. October of 1917. In the school textbooks of the Soviet Union and post-Soviet countries, in revolutionary marches and posters, October, October, October. The revolution actually took place in November, specifically on November 7, 1917, according to the new calendar. This isn't a typo or a minor discrepancy. It's a result of one of the longest-running calendar confusions in European history. In 1917, Russia was still using the Julian calendar, also known as the Old Style, which was introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. By the 20th century, the Julian calendar was 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar, which was adopted by most countries around the world. Western Europe switched to the Gregorian calendar in the 16th and 17th centuries, while Russia did not transition until after the Revolution, in February 1918. October 25th in the Old Style is November 7th in the New Style. The Soviet power was well aware of this discrepancy. Officially, the revolution was referred to as October, based on the date of the old calendar in which it occurred. The Soviet Union celebrated its anniversary on November 7th, that is, according to the new calendar, while still keeping the official title of October. This created a linguistic construct where celebrations in November honored October events. Over time, people grew accustomed to this inconsistency and stopped noticing it. This isn't the only such confusion in Russian revolutionary chronology. The February Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar, occurred in February according to the Old Style, meaning it happened in March according to the new calendar. Valentine's Day is celebrated in Russia on February 14th, but the Old New Year is observed on January 13th, which is a direct legacy of the same calendar difference. What's important is that the Bolsheviks themselves understood the calendar they lived by in 17. Lenin dated documents with the 25th of October. When the Winter Palace was taken, according to their clocks and theirs calendar, it was indeed October. But for the rest of the world, living by the Gregorian calendar, it was November. The myth is not that the revolution is called October. That is historically accurate for those who let it. The myth lies in our unconscious assumption that the date in textbooks corresponds to our familiar calendar. The next myth also deals with the mismatch between image and reality. This time, it's about the most famous teetotaler of the 20th century, who was not one at all. Myth number 20. The teetotaler who wasn't given the right drink. Winston Churchill and alcohol make for a whole genre of historical anecdotes. Madam, I am drunk, but in the morning I will be sober, and you will still be ugly. Whiskey and soda in hand in all the photographs. A bottle of brandy on the nightstand. Churchill is a symbol of a functioning alcoholic in power during the toughest of times. Here's a revised script suitable for voiceover, translated into English while maintaining clarity and natural flow. There's a myth surrounding Winston Churchill that goes in the opposite direction. A legend suggesting that before World War II, or at some point in his life, Churchill was either moderate or completely abstinent when it came to drinking. Some popular biographers have attempted to craft a narrative of a sober Churchill who only became a drinker due to the war. This is incorrect. Churchill drank throughout nearly his entire adult life, methodically, abundantly, and with immense pleasure. His first encounter with alcohol dates back to his military service in India during the 1890s, when the young officer discovered that whiskey and soda was the best defense against dysentery in the hot climate. This viewpoint was somewhat a medical perspective of the time, as alcohol was considered an antimicrobial agent. However, the real historical myth is different. It revolves around a true story of how Churchill once genuinely abstained from alcohol. In 1936, after being diagnosed with severe digestive issues, his doctors strongly recommended he refrain from drinking. According to some reports, he adhered to this advice for a while and publicly lamented it as one of the greatest trials of his life. But there's another, much more curious aspect to this story. Churchill developed a highly intricate set of personal rules regarding alcohol that allowed him to drink a lot while still believing he was fully in control. He never consumed hard liquor without dilution. His famous whiskey and soda was very weak, almost ceremonial. He would stretch brandy out over several hours. According to his personal secretary, Churchill was convinced he was drinking correctly and that alcohol was not harmful to him. The question of whether this was true remains open in medical history. But what is fundamentally important is that the image of sober Churchill, or Churchill who became a drunk only due to the war, is a distortion. He drank throughout his life and managed an empire while leading a world war, all with a drink in hand. This myth reflects our desire to find periods of virtue in great individuals. The next myth is about grand structures that we misunderstand. Myth number 21. Lighthouses that were more than just fire. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Standing, according to various estimates, between 100 and 150 meters tall, a fire at its peak, visible from 50 kilometers away. When we envision this lighthouse, our imagination conjures up a massive tower with a flame atop it, perhaps in a metal cauldron, fire, smoke, primitive yet majestic at the same time. This representation downplays reality to such an extent that it becomes a curious wonder of simplification. Ancient sources describing the Lighthouse of Alexandria mention several details that do not fit the image of just a tall tower with a flame. Strabo, who visited the lighthouse around the time of Augustus, along with other authors, remarked that the lighthouse's light was not just visible at great distances, but could be seen at night, from distances technically impossible for an open flame without some sort of amplification system. According to several historians and experts in ancient technology, a system of amplification utilized polished bronze mirrors as metallic reflectors to concentrate and direct light. This is not mere speculation. Hero of Alexandria and other ancient engineers left behind treatises on the use of metallic mirrors for optical effects. The technology was well known. It made logical and practical sense to use it in a lighthouse. Moreover, there are mentions that the lighthouse could have served not only as a navigational landmark, but also as a kind of long-range observation system. If the mirrors could concentrate and project light over great distances, then in the opposite direction, with the right orientation, they could theoretically allow for the observation of distant objects. While this is speculative and not directly supported by sources, the very idea of a primitive telescope made of polished bronze is not far-fetched for the level of Alexandrian science. The lighthouse functioned for about 500 to 600 years. It was damaged by a series of earthquakes in the 14th century and was subsequently used as a source of building stone for the citadel of Bay, which still stands in its place today. Underwater expeditions in the harbor of Alexandria have uncovered huge stone blocks, some of which have been identified as fragments of the lighthouse. To refer to it as just a tall tower with a fire is akin to calling the Antikythera mechanism just a piece of bronze. The truth is far more complex and infinitely more interesting. The next myth involves a man who is also credited with more than he actually was. Myth number 22, the president who wasn't Benjamin Franklin. One of the founding fathers of the United States, a great scientist, diplomat, writer, and inventor. His portrait graces the $100 bill. He is the embodiment of the American dream. He was never president of the United States. This is one of those myths that seems absurd once debunked. How could anyone think Franklin was a president? Yet, sociological surveys conducted in various countries consistently reveal a significant percentage of people, especially non-Americans, who are convinced that Franklin held the presidential office. The mechanism behind this myth is clear. A portrait on money is associated with the presidency. Washington is on the $1 bill, Lincoln on the $5 bill, Jefferson on the $2 bill, Hamilton on the $10 bill. By the way, Hamilton was also never a president. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury. But this monetary association remains strong. Franklin's real career was far richer and more interesting than any presidential term. He served as governor of Pennsylvania for 3 terms, making him the oldest governor in the state's history. He was the first Postmaster General of the United States. He was the American ambassador to France during a critically important period of the War for Independence, and secured the French military alliance, without which the American Revolution would likely have failed. His scientific experiments with electricity, including the famous kite experiment during a thunderstorm, were serious scientific endeavors, not just flashy stunts. He developed the theory of electric charge, introduced the terms positive and negative charge, and invented the lightning rod. The Royal Society of London elected him as a fellow. Franklin was older than all the other founding fathers and passed away in April 1790, a year after Washington's inauguration. He signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, as well as the peace treaty with Great Britain, 3 documents that defined the existence of a new nation. No one else signed all 3. He was not a president. He was something more important. The next myth concerns the disparity between perception and reality, this time regarding the cruelty we associate with the past. Myth number 23. Executions that no one saw. Medieval executions. In our minds, there's a large crowd in a square, a festive atmosphere, children on their father's shoulders, vendors selling pies. Executions as public spectacles, entertainment for all social classes, a noisy, brutal theater of death. This image is deeply rooted in popular culture, in novels, films, and TV series. It's not entirely false. Public executions were indeed part of the medieval legal system, but the reality is much more complicated than just a carnival around the gallows. First of all, not all medieval executions were public. A significant number of death sentences were carried out in prison courtyards, with only officials present: the judge, the priest, the executioner, and a few witnesses. This typically applied to executions of those convicted of crimes that authorities wanted to suppress, or those for whom publicity could create a martyr's aura. When executions were public, the crowd's reaction was often much more complex than we imagine. Sources describe instances where the crowd intervened on behalf of the condemned, prompting authorities to reconsider the sentence. They recount tears and loud wailing from the crowd. They depict situations where the executioner couldn't perform the task quickly and cleanly, leading to public anger, not directed at the execution itself, but at the poor execution of the execution, which was seen as an insult to the condemned. Medieval public executions were primarily legal rituals. They were meant to showcase the triumph of the law, not merely to provide a spectacle of death. In most cases, the condemned was given an opportunity to speak before dying, confess to a priest, and receive communion. This wasn't humanism as we understand it. It was a religious procedure intended to ensure the salvation of the soul. However, it added a different dimension to the execution than simply killing for the crowd's amusement. Moreover, the very concept of public execution as entertainment is a construct of a later era. It was during the 18th and early 19th centuries when Enlightenment thinkers began to criticize public executions as barbaric, that the image of the Dark Middle Ages ravenously consuming death as entertainment emerged in public discourse. Reformers needed this image. It heightened the contrast with the enlightened present. Executions were a part of medieval life, harsh, without a doubt, but the carnival of death is a late projection, not a historical reality. The next myth is about a different kind of cruelty, this time scientific. Myth number 24. The vaccine that wasn't tested on humans by chance. On July 6, 1885, Louis Pasteur, a French chemist and microbiologist, faced a painful decision. He was presented with a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister, who had been bitten by a rabid dog just 4 days earlier, suffering 14 deep bites. Without treatment, death was almost certain. Pasteur had developed a rabies vaccine tested on dogs, but never on humans. This was a risk. It violated scientific protocol. It could kill the boy. But the alternative was a certain death from hydrophobia. Pasteur made his choice. Meister received the weakened rabies virus, 13 injections over 10 days. The boy survived. This became one of the greatest triumphs of 19th century medicine. However, the myth of chance in this story is completely fabricated. There is no version where Pasteur accidentally tested the vaccine on a human. The decision was deliberate, agonizing, and well documented. Pasteur recorded all his doubts, calculations, and the decision-making process in his journal. He consulted with colleagues. He understood the ethical and legal ramifications. So where did the myth of chance come from? Likely from a romantic desire to make the story more dramatic. A brilliant scientist risking everything in a moment of human tragedy and succeeding. Chance lends an element of fate, of providence to the narrative. The real story doesn't need this embellishment. Pasteur did not accidentally test the vaccine. He made a conscious decision to break scientific norms in the face of a child's imminent death. This was a complex ethical choice, not a happy accident. The difference is significant. Interestingly, before Meister, Pasteur considered other cases, several adults bitten by rabid animals, but always postponed using the vaccine because the bite had not occurred recently enough or because he was uncertain about the diagnosis. In Meister's case, everything aligned: a recent bite, an accurate diagnosis of rabies confirmed by autopsy, and the inevitability of death. This was not a chance occurrence. It was a precise, cold, courageous necessity. The next myth also concerns difficult decisions made under challenging circumstances. Myth number 25. Dissidents who weren't sent to Siberia. Sent to Siberia is a common expression in Russian and many languages, meaning cruel exile to a remote place. In the collective consciousness, a Soviet dissident is almost always depicted as a person in a warm coat against a backdrop of snow-covered tundra. The reality of Soviet repression against dissenters was far more varied and, in some aspects, much more sophisticated. Firstly, the term Siberia as a place of exile was not applied uniformly. During the Stalin era, the Gulag system certainly covered vast territories, including Kolyma, Vorkuta, and Magadan. But the Gulag camps existed all throughout the Soviet Union, in the Moscow region, in the Urals, and in Kazakhstan. Referring to Siberia as a synonym for repression simplifies the real geography of the situation. Secondly, and this is crucial, in the post-Stalin era, starting from the 60s, the regime developed a tool that many historians consider more brutal than physical exile. We're talking about punitive psychiatry. Soviet psychiatry created a specific diagnosis: slowly progressing schizophrenia. This was theoretically justified by Andrei Snezhnevsky, and this diagnosis was unique to Soviet psychiatry, not recognized anywhere else in the world. The essence of the diagnosis was that a person systematically opposing Soviet authority must be mentally ill, because a normal person wouldn't willingly seek out trouble. Protest against the system itself was seen as a symptom of illness. Dissidents were placed in special psychiatric hospitals, referred to as psychiatric wards in Soviet slang, where they were treated with antipsychotic medications that caused severe side effects. This was not only physically destructive, but also politically lethal. How can you take seriously the arguments of someone officially declared insane? Pyotr Grigorenko, a Soviet general and human rights activist, spent several years in psychiatric hospitals. Vladimir Bukovsky gathered and smuggled documentation about punitive psychiatry to the West and was sentenced for it. Natalia Gorbanovskaya, a participant in the Red Square protest against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, was placed in a psychiatric hospital. None of them were in Siberia in the sense that phrase conveys. The myth of Siberia as a universal Soviet response to dissent conceals a much more complex and sophisticated system of repression. The next myth is about an event often viewed as smooth and trouble-free. Myth number 26, a scandal-free Olympics. Athens, 1996, the first modern Olympics. In our imagination, a beautiful scene unfolds, an international celebration of sports, friendship among nations, a revival of ancient ideals. However, the first modern Olympic Games were filled with scandals, political intrigues, disqualifications, and organizational chaos from the very beginning. Let's start with the participants. The Games were planned as an international competition, but most countries sent not official teams, but random tourists, students, and soldiers who happened to be in Greece at the right time. The American team was primarily made up of students from the Boston Athletic Club, who learned about the Games just weeks before and paid for their trip out of their own pockets. The British delegation was so modest that many participants from the British Isles competed for other countries or as individuals. The marathon, the main event of the Games, meant to recreate the legendary run of a Greek warrior from Marathon to Athens, concluded with Greek runner Spiridon Lewis winning the race. The Greeks rejoiced. Princes accompanied the winner to the finish line. It was a moment of national triumph. However, crossing the finish line first was another competitor, Spiridon Bolokis, also a Greek. He was immediately disqualified when it was discovered that he had covered part of the race distance in a cart. This was not a mistake or ignorance, but a deliberate act of cheating in the main event of the Games. Another scandal erupted in bicycle racing. The winner was accused of using performance enhancers. This had already become a hot topic in sports by 1896. The organizing committee changed the rules several times during the competitions. The composition of the judges was contested by the participants. The Greek government intervened in the committee's decisions under the pressure of nationalist sentiments. In other words, the first modern Olympic Games were more like all the subsequent ones than we would like to admit. The next myth is about the Great Structure. Myth number 27, the wall not built for Mongols. The Great Wall of China, the longest defensive structure in history. Built over centuries to stop Mongolian nomads from the north. This is common knowledge, but it is incorrect, or at least incomplete. Let's start with the timeline. The first fortified walls in northern China were built during the Warring States period, 5th to 3rd centuries BC. This was 1,000 years before the Mongols emerged as a historical force. The walls were built against the Xiongnu, the Shanbei, and other nomadic tribes that changed over the centuries. The Mongolian threat is a specifically late medieval context, when the walls had already existed for many centuries. Moreover, the Great Wall of China that we see in photographs today, with brick towers, smooth battlements, and tourist viewing platforms, is mostly a construction from the Ming dynasty, that is, from the 14th to 17th centuries. This is nearly modern history in the scale of Chinese civilization. And it was constructed after Mongolian rule, when the Mongols had been expelled but the threat from the north still remained. Qin Shi Huang, the first Chinese emperor who unified the country in 221 BC, ordered the connection of existing disparate walls into a single system. This was a massive undertaking that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of laborers. But this was neither the first nor the main stage in the creation of the wall. It was one of many. The most paradoxical point is that despite its length, the Great Wall was militarily ineffective. The Mongols under Genghis Khan conquered China. The Manchus conquered China. The Xiongnu raided for centuries. The wall did not stop armies. It slowed down small detachments, provided a signaling system, and served as a base for border troops. It was infrastructure for managing the border, not an insurmountable barrier. Therefore, the history of the Great Wall is not the story of a single construction project meant for one enemy. This is a 1,000-year saga of Chinese states building relationships with the nomadic world through a complex mix of military power, trade agreements, diplomatic marriages, and yes, physical barriers. The next myth is about another barrier, a crisis that was closer to the end of the world than we realize. Myth number 28, a crisis that was not the only one. October 1962, Soviet missiles in Cuba. an American blockade, 13 days on the brink of nuclear war. In school textbooks, and rightly so, this is described as the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, when humanity stood at the edge of a cliff. This is true. But this truth creates a misleading impression that this moment was the only one and unique. That before and after, the world was safe. It was not safe. There were other moments when nuclear catastrophe was frighteningly close. November 1983. NATO exercises codenamed Able Archer 83 simulated a scenario of transitioning to nuclear war with such realism that Soviet leadership, documented in declassified papers, was convinced this was not just a drill, but preparation for a real strike. The KGB received intelligence that nuclear forces in Western Europe were being placed on high alert. Soviet nuclear forces were put on increased readiness. A few factors saved the situation, including the fact that Soviet intelligence had agents inside NATO who were able to confirm this was indeed a drill. But for several days, the world teetered on the brink of war, unaware of it. September 1983, weeks before Able Archer. Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov, on duty at the early warning system, received a signal about the launch of American missiles. 5 missiles heading toward the USSR. According to protocol, he was obligated to report the launch to command, which would automatically initiate a counterstrike procedure. Petrov did not report it. He decided it was a false alarm because, in his logic, a real attack would involve hundreds of missiles, not just 5. He was right. It was a malfunction of satellite equipment. But at that moment, he could not be sure. One Soviet lieutenant colonel, acting against orders, may have prevented a nuclear exchange in 1983. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the most well-known nuclear moment of the Cold War. But it was not the only one, and perhaps not the closest to disaster. The next myth is about people whom we portray in monochrome. Myth number 29. Monks who did everything else. A medieval monk. In popular imagination, a quiet figure in a dark robe, endlessly bent over manuscripts by candlelight. Prayer, copying texts, silence. A humble life outside the world. Real medieval monasteries were so multifunctional that it's hard to describe them with just one characteristic. Monasteries were banks. The church prohibited usury, charging interest, from lay people. Monastic orders devised legal structures that allowed them, in practice, to engage in lending operations, leasing instead of a loan, gifts instead of interest. Monasteries accumulated vast wealth and financed construction, trade, and even wars. Monasteries functioned as hospitals. Their infirmaries provided medical care for pilgrims, the poor, and travelers. Monk physicians studied Arabic medical treatises translated in Toledo and Sicily, applying ancient and Islamic medical knowledge in practice. Monasteries were breweries. This is not a metaphor. The production of beer and wine was one of the key industries for monasteries, as water in medieval cities was often unsafe. Beer was a safer and more nourishing option. Monastic beer became a staple product sold in markets, generating income. Monasteries served as lodging places, hospitals in the etymological sense of the word, from the Latin hospice, meaning guest. The rule of Saint Benedict explicitly instructed monks to treat travelers as if they were Christ. Monasteries along pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and Jerusalem provided shelter and food for thousands each year. Monasteries were also centers of technological innovation. Monastic orders implemented and refined water mills, mechanical clocks, and agricultural practices. The Cistercians became renowned masters of hydraulic engineering, their monastic complexes featuring complex systems for water supply and sewage. And yes, monasteries copied manuscripts, but this was just one of many activities. If fully described in schoolbooks, it would shatter the image of the quiet scriptorium as the only monastic reality. The last myth is about a civilization we believe is well understood. Myth number 30, the history we don't know. Ancient Rome. Seemingly the most studied civilization in history. Thousands of Latin texts, legal codes, historical chronicles, architectural monuments, coins, inscriptions, and frescoes. We know more about Rome than any other civilization of the ancient world. This is an illusion based on the relative abundance of sources. Let's start with the most obvious point. Everything we know about Rome has passed through the filter of scribes. Throughout the Middle Ages, texts by ancient authors existed solely in handwritten copies, which were transcribed by monks. A scribe, no matter how diligent, was not a neutral conduit. He might make mistakes, correct what he thought were errors in the original, or skip over confusing or inappropriate passages. Each generation of copies introduced its own distortions. Some famous ancient texts were actually written or substantially edited in the Middle Ages. The Gestae Romanorum, Acts of the Romans, was a widely read medieval anthology containing stories attributed to Rome that were, in reality, medieval inventions. The task of distinguishing genuinely ancient texts from medieval forgeries remains a subject of philological research. But deeper than these issues with sources lies a more fundamental problem. We know Rome mainly through texts written by a narrow segment of an educated elite, predominantly male and mostly from the senatorial class, based in the city of Rome itself. A vast part of the Roman Empire, its provinces, lower classes, women, slaves, soldiers, merchants, and peasants, remains largely silent in the sources or speaks through intermediaries who often distort their voices. What don't we know about Rome? We don't know exactly how Latin sounded. There are, of course, no sound recordings, and reconstructing pronunciation is a matter of debate. We don't know the precise chronology of the early centuries of Roman history. The period of the kings and the early republic is known to us through sources written 500 to 700 years after the events themselves. Livy, who describes the founding of Rome and its early wars, lived in the time of Augustus, 700 years after Romulus. The fire of Rome during Nero's reign in 64 AD destroyed a vast number of documents, administrative, historical, literary. No one knows exactly what was lost, as there are few descriptions of the vanished texts. Then there are Herculaneum and Pompeii. Cities buried in volcanic ash in 79 AD, they preserved an immense amount of information about daily life: graffiti on walls, tavern menus, love notes, trade announcements. This is a rare window into a reality not found in official sources. And a significant portion of this material remains unprocessed and unpublished. In other words, we know Rome through the educated elite. We know the Rome that passed through medieval scriptoria. We do not know, or know only in fragments, the Rome of slaves, soldiers, provincials, women, and craftsmen. And that is the majority of Rome. The well-documented Rome is a myth created by those who have read enough to believe in the completeness of their knowledge, but not enough to see the large dark spots on the map of that knowledge. 30 stories, 30 moments when reality turned out to be richer, stranger, and more human than the simplifications we usually replace it with. What connects all these myths? Not malicious intent. Not a conspiracy of liars. Most of them emerged from entirely understandable human needs. We need untainted heroes. We need simple causes. We need order in the chaos of the past. We need recognizable villains. We want great events to have dramatic, human explanations. We want the civilizations we admire to be clear and complete. Reality refuses to be so obedient. Washington sat in a boat because otherwise he would have drowned. Marie Curie knew of the dangers and approached them with open eyes. Medieval monks brewed beer and lent money. Apostles argued about politics. Mongols conquered China using the very wall that was supposedly built against them. The first flight of the Wright brothers was met with silence. History is neither a heroic narrative nor a tragedy. It is something more rare and valuable. An unpredictable, complex, and detail-rich truth about how people lived, made mistakes, invented, deceived, suffered, and, at times, achieved something truly great. The archive remains open.